Hello, and welcome back to English 112 here at Delta College. This is week 6, and this week we're going to be looking at revision and editing again. As I said before, for each of the essay assignments in here, there's going to be a revision and editing lesson that's associated with it that builds on what came before. So this week we're going to be talking about revising introductions and editing word errors. So let's go ahead and get started. So, introductions. Introductions need to do three things. They should do more than that, but they need to do three things. They have to provide context or the thematic subject. So, it has to tell the reader what the background information is or what the context of your argument is going to be. It has to introduce the topic, which is the specific idea or question that you're going to be exploring. And then it needs to state the thesis. And the thesis is your statement about whatever it is that you're setting out to prove about that topic. So often this gets represented as the inverted triangle, where you go from the broad base of the subject to the narrow point of the thesis. So you go from the subject, which is the background information, to the topic, which is the specific aspect of the subject upon which you're going to focus. Excuse me. And then your thesis is whatever point you want to make about that topic. So if the topic is a question, for example, then your thesis is the answer to that question. Now, remember that for this next assignment, you're making a claim of value for the rhetorical analysis. So you're making a value judgment about the quality of someone's argument. For the next assignment, the editorial, you're going to be making a claim of truth. So in this case, your thesis needs to say whether the argument is good or not, or something to that effect. And then for the next assignments, your thesis needs to say that something is so, at least in your opinion. Now, like I said, introductions need to do three things, but they should do more. And what they should do is connect with the audience and create what's called the personal interest factor, or the PIF. And there are various techniques that you can use in order to create that personal interest factor. So using questions, quotations, anecdotes, startling facts or assertions, allusions, really any of those rhetorical strategies that we've talked about, those can be used in the introduction in order to connect with the audience. And really the idea here is you want to build common ground with your audience. You want to be able to speak to the audience on their level, or at least expect them to follow you on yours. And you want to be able to establish some basis or some points that everyone can agree on and move on from there. So you can use questions to help build that common ground. Questions are good for a couple reasons. When we ask a question, even if it's a rhetorical question in which the answer is implied by the question itself, we feel that we should answer questions. So when you ask a question in your introduction, the reader will feel a need or a desire to answer that question, or at least read ahead to find the answer. So it creates a certain amount of tension in the reader. Questions are also good because of the use of the question mark as punctuation. It helps to draw the eye and break up the blockiness of your text. So it creates visual interest for the reader. Similarly, quotations serve a similar function. The use of the quotation marks helps to draw the eye and provide visual interest. And if your quotation contains a question, then you've got 2 for 1 there. But quotations also work because it helps the reader feel as if he or she is being asked to participate in a conversation or a dialogue. And so quotations make the reader feel more involved. Anecdotes are good because anecdotes create that common ground by relating a story which helps to illustrate your point and helps to make it more relatable. So you're discussing in the issue in very human terms, which is something that the readers can relate to and can recognize. Startling facts or assertions can work as well, because that certainly causes attention to be paid. So if you surprise someone by using a startling fact or a statistic, then that will sort of shock them a little bit and make them want to read a little bit more. Or if you have a bold statement that provokes some sort of emotional response, then that is going to help engage the reader as well. And then allusions work because, as we've talked about before, allusions are references to things which the audience should recognize and apply their understanding of that reference to whatever it is that you're talking about. So allusions work as long as your audience gets the reference. And so if you have tailored your arguments to your audience well, then you can use allusions to get them on your side, or at least get them to understand what you're talking about more easily. Let's take a look at a couple examples. These are from the required readings, or at least the assigned readings, which are linked on e-learning. So the first one is from Stanley Fish's rhetorical analysis on the other car. And note that the introduction here is 3 paragraphs. And that's something which I think is important to know, or important to recognize or realize, that introductions don't have to be 1 paragraph. And often when you get into more upper division writing, 1 paragraph isn't going to work, because if you're going to be writing, let's say, a 15 or 20-page research paper, a 1 paragraph introduction just is not suitable. It's not going to work. You're going to have too much information. So again, if you go back to the idea that an introduction needs to do 3 things, which is to present the subject, the topic, and the thesis, well, that's 3 paragraphs right there. And that's what Stanley Fish does in his article, is he devotes the first 3 paragraphs to establishing the subject, the topic, and the thesis. So don't think of introductions as paragraphs, but think of them as sections. So the introductory section of your paper, it can be more than 1 paragraph. And in the hands of a sophisticated and experienced writer, it could be several paragraphs. And in his introduction, Stanley Fish uses anecdote. In fact, he begins with anecdote. He writes, 6 years ago, my wife and I traded in 2 cars for 2 new used ones. Twice in a few weeks, one of us drove an old car up a ramp to the cavernous 2nd floor of the dealership and just left it there. Well, not quite, for later we reported to each other the same experience. Each of us walked away, but then looked back, realizing that this familiar friend would be gone from our lives forever, and more poignantly, that we were abandoning a faithful, if increasingly troublesome, retainer. So he uses that anecdote to talk about a experience that he had that's a very common experience that many people have had, of trading in a car or having to sell a car that they've had for many years. And it's he personifies the car by referring to the car, or the cars rather, as familiar friends and retainers. So that helps to humanize the experience and make it more relatable. And so his first paragraph is an anecdote. He begins with that in order to connect with the reader on an emotional level in a way that the reader can relate to. And then he uses allusions in his introduction. Specifically, he refers to Stephen King's Christine and Arthur Clarke's Hal, which helps to carry on this analogy that he's using of comparing these cars or these machines to people in the roles that they fit in our lives. He asks a question: can you, in fact, mistreat, except in a technical sense, a machine? And then he uses assertion, and this is where he gets to the thesis. He is looking at the advertising campaign that Avis Rent-A-Car used several years ago. And he says the genius of the commercials is that they foreground the sexuality that informs the relationship between the car owner and the object of his/her affection. So he is using several techniques here in his introduction in order to connect with the reader and get the reader's attention. The second example I want to look at is by Jake Rom, which is why that catastrophic Pepsi ad was actually a resounding success. And this is, or rather, the first 4 paragraphs of this article serves as the introduction. So he uses allusion, referring to Kendall Jenner, Black Lives Matter, and Trump, which are references that he is assuming his reader is going to get. Now, not every reader is going to understand these references, and that tells you something about his audience, that his audience is younger and more tech savvy or media savvy or aware than perhaps an older audience would be. The title itself refers to that catastrophic Pepsi ad, which he is again relying on his audience to know. And I think if his audience is that younger, more tech and media savvy audience, then they probably will get the reference. He uses a quotation there in his first paragraph. So the analysis is about the Pepsi ad in which Kendall Jenner is seen joining a protest movement and shares a Pepsi with a police officer in order to create a sense of unity, as Pepsi says. So he quotes Pepsi. Pepsi was trying to project a global message of unity, peace, and understanding. Clearly, we missed the mark, and we apologize. We did not intend to make light of any serious issue. We are removing the content and halting any further rollout. So he's using that authority, if you will, in order to do 2 things. First of all, to show that he's done his research. So he's looked this up. He's quoting his source and citing his source. But also, again, that use of the quotation helps to draw the eye and makes the reader feel as if they're participating in a conversation. Then he uses assertion, and there are several assertions, probably more assertions than anything else in his introduction. But the first one of note is where he says, the damage is done, and the whole story is instructive. That's right there in the first paragraph. And then that first paragraph continues with anecdote. So this first paragraph is packed with a lot of these techniques in order to connect with the reader and engage the reader. So the anecdote is where he goes on to describe what happens in the ad. He says, a protest for unity and peace breaks out on the streets. A meticulously diverse cast of attractive, young, creative types join the march. As they proceed down the street, the marchers pass Kendall Jenner, who in a moment of spirited independence interrupts a fashion shoot to join the protest. And then it goes on from there. And then the first line of the second paragraph is a question. So what do we have here? And then he goes on to include more of those techniques in the next few paragraphs, building up to his thesis in the fourth paragraph. This commonplace problem should prompt us to consider the ad not within the context of the present political moment, but rather within the larger context of capitalism itself. And then note that he ends that paragraph with an extended quotation, this time coming from Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. So, again, a more sophisticated kind of introduction, longer than one paragraph, and is packed with all of these techniques that we've talked about here. So when you write your own introductions, these are the sorts of things that you can do in order to engage with your reader. I like using anecdotes to begin with, and then moving into questions and quotations. But that's just my personal preference. You should use what works best for you and what works best for your audience and your purpose in writing uh, your argument, your essay, whatever it is about. Okay. So let's shift now to editing. And this week we're talking about word errors. So last time, the editing lesson was about punctuation, which is the smallest unit of meaning in writing. Now we're moving to the next smallest unit of meaning, which is the word and common word errors. So word errors tend to fall into three categories: those which are homonyms, grammar, parts of speech, and spelling. So homonyms, if you think back to your elementary school education, are words that people confuse based on the way that they sound or sometimes the way that they're spelt. And then sometimes people confuse words based on parts of speech most frequently, or they make some grammatical error, in which case they use the wrong word. And then finally, the third category is simple spelling errors. Okay, so homonyms. There are two types of homonyms. There are homophones, which literally means same sound, and those are words that are pronounced alike but are spelled differently. And then homographs, which means same writing, and those are words that are spelled the same way but are pronounced differently. And when it comes to homonymic errors, not many of them are homographs. There's a couple that people get a little confused about, but for the most part, the homonymic errors fall into the category of homophones because we use this is the sort of thing that drives non-native speakers nuts. English uses so many words that are pronounced in the same way but mean different things, which, to my knowledge, English is the only language that does that. And there is a reason for that, as we'll get into. But also, there's a certain amount of laziness on our part, especially here in the US, because we tend to pronounce words, or rather mispronounce words. And so we will create false homophones by pronouncing words in really similar ways, even when they're not supposed to be pronounced in those ways. So, some common homophonic errors. The three forms of there. Now, first of all, most of you, probably all of you, know the difference between these words. I mean, again, we learn this in grade school, right, in our elementary education, second or third grade. But we tend to get lazy, and so we will often misuse the word or use the wrong word because maybe we don't proofread, or we rely on a spell check program, and it won't catch them because they're spelled correctly, but they're not the right word. And so we don't necessarily think too much about these. And it's kind of unfortunate because, again, if you look at the way people use English on social media, and they make these mistakes, it really affects the way they are perceived and how seriously they get taken. So there, and there. So the first there people realize as representing or referring to a place. And an easy way to remember that is it contains the word here. The second there is the possessive, as belonging to them. And there with the apostrophe is they are. Now, most people don't have trouble with that third form because they realize that with the apostrophe that it is a contraction. They confuse the other two forms of there, often using the place or the location when they mean to use the possessive. To, the three forms of to, yes, very similar. So the first form, to, is a preposition. It indicates place or location, going to somewhere. The second form with a w, two, is the number two, which people don't have too much trouble with that because they recognize that the W represents or the W signals to them that you're using the number. It's the third form of to that gets confusing. So that's an intensifier. It means too much or too little or something, or it also means also. And so people confuse the first and third forms of to. So it's those two twos that people get into trouble with. It's and it's. This one I understand. And in fact, I always have to stop and think about this one myself. So it's without the apostrophe is the possessive, belonging to it. With the apostrophe, it's a contraction of it is. And like I said, I understand the confusion there because usually in order to form a possessive, you would use an apostrophe. But this is one of those irregular words where it's already in its possessive form without the apostrophe. And it's the same thing with whose. So whose without the apostrophe is the possessive, with the apostrophe is the contraction of who is. Sight, sight, and sight. Okay, so why is it that these three words, which are really spelt quite differently, why is that they're pronounced the same way? And this is one of the reasons why, like I said, non-native speakers kind of go crazy about this because English is really weird in its use of homophones. There is a reason for it, and that's because originally these words were not pronounced in the same way. There is something which happens in the English language around 1500, which is called the Great Vowel Shift, which basically means that something occurred which changed the way we pronounce our words. And so these words were originally pronounced, all of these words were originally pronounced differently, and so they didn't sound alike, but now they are. So in the case of sight, C-I-T-E would have been pronounced kita originally. That means citing a source or a citation. Site, S-I-T-E, sita, means a place, a site, a website, for example. And then S-I-G-H-T, or sit, as it was originally pronounced, refers to vision. So English begins as a form of German, what we call Anglo-Saxon. And so we more commonly call it Old English. And that's because England was conquered by essentially by Vikings in the around about 500 or so. And then they introduced their language into to England, or what is now England. And then in 1066, during the Norman conquest, the Normans invaded from France and they introduced French into the language. And that changed the language again. So English is what's called a polyglot language. It's comprised of many tongues. So we borrow a lot of words from different languages. Which is why we have so many different words to describe the same thing, which is something else which drives non-native speakers nuts. So think about our food, for example. When you when you have food on your dinner table, it has one name, but when it's on the hoof, if you will, out in the barnyard, it has a different name. So we eat beef, for example. We don't eat cow, even though cow is where we get beef. Beef is a French word. Cow is Anglo-Saxon. It's the same thing with chicken and poultry, or with deer and venison. The same thing. When it's in its animal form, it has an Anglo-Saxon name. And when it's on the dinner table, when it's been prepared, it's got a Norman French name. Okay. So that's one cause of why English has so many different words to describe the same things. And then the printing press was introduced into England in, I believe it was 1476. And that came from France. And the French language doesn't use all of the same sounds or phonemes as English does. Because again, English is a type of German. And so, how do you indicate certain English sounds using French type on the French printing press? So they would have to use the closest approximation, which would ultimately change our alphabet. So going back to sight, Sight, originally would have been pronounced sicht, which is much more German. The G and the H, why is it pronounced sight now? Because that doesn't make sense. Well, again, it wasn't pronounced that way originally. But also, how do you represent that ha sound, which in Old English is called the yog? It's represented in an alphabetical character that looks kind of like the number 3. How do you represent that in French type? And they decided to use the G and the H to represent that sound, even though gah isn't really the same thing as ha. Okay. Right. Rite, Rita, means a ritual or a rite of passage. Write, Rita, is to write. Right, Rit, means correct, or it means the opposite of left. And Wright, Rit, is someone who builds something. And I've put an asterisk there because that form of right isn't very common anymore. It's kind of archaic, but you still come across it sometimes. Through and through, same thing. Through and thruff originally, or thruff, originally pronounced differently. Now we pronounce them in the same way, have very different spellings. Break and break, same thing there. And then your. Now, this is where you get a little bit more problematic because of the change in the alphabet. So if you ever read Shakespeare and it's full of those these and thous, which means you, why did he use those instead of just saying you? Well, this is because in Old English there is another character of the alphabet called the thorn, which represents the th sound. How do you represent that using French type? Well, there's 2 ways. You can use the T and H, or tah, or another way is to use the letter Y, because the thorn character basically looks like a thorn. So if you have like a stem, a flower stem with a thorn sticking out of it, that's essentially what that character in the alphabet looked like. So the closest visual approximation was the Y. And so your, or you, and thou were originally pronounced in the same way. So your, as the possessive, Y-O-U-R, Y-O-U apostrophe R-E is you are. So again, it's your, the first one is a possessive, with the apostrophe as a contraction. And then just for the fun, I threw in this extra form of your, which isn't very common anymore. It's really archaic, referencing a time long ago, in the days of yore, which originally would have been pronounced as the days of Thor, the god of thunder. Okay. False homophone errors. So these are words that technically are not pronounced in the same way, but we get a little lazy with our pronunciation, and so we do pronounce them in the same way, which ends up causing confusion. So accept and accept, the first form means to take in, the second form means to leave out. Affect and effect, this gets a little confusing. Typically, affect is used as a verb, whereas effect is used as a noun, although you can use them in other ways, but that just creates confusion. So, easiest way to remember it, with an A, it's a verb. With an E, it's a noun. Just stick with that. Whether and whether. So Weather refers to what's happening outside. And then the other form is conveys a sense of opposition, whether or not, for example. Past and past, that's really confusing. Basically, you're talking about sort of time and space. So if you're passing something, the past tense of that would be PASSED. And then PAST refers to, like, again, the past, the time period. Then and than, often confused. Then indicates a sequence of events. Than represents options or choices. And this next one I don't understand. Root and route. They are pronounced very differently. And it seems pretty clear from the spelling that they should be pronounced differently as well. I mean, route has the word out right there in the middle of it. So I don't understand why people pronounce those in the same way. And then these last two really kind of annoy me because through, THRU, is not an actual word. I know you go to, let's say you go to McDonald's and it says drive through and they spell it THRU. A lot of places that have drive through windows spell it that way. And it's so annoying to me because that's not an actual word, but because people see it so often, they think that it is. They get tricked. And so they will think it's a legitimate word and they will spell it that way. It's not a word. Don't use it. And it's the same thing with light, L-E or L-I-T-E rather. That's not a word. I know if you look at light beer, it often spells it that way. Again, not a real word. This is our society conspiring to make you illiterate. So don't use L-I-T-E. Don't use T-H-R-U. Those aren't real words. Okay, and homophonic and homographic errors. Now, like I said, most people don't have trouble with homographs. They can tell from the context how the words are supposed to be pronounced, even though they're spelt the same way. The only one that really causes trouble is lead and lead. So lead, L-E-A-D, is the verb of to lead. Lead, L-E-A-D, is the material, the lead, the metal lead. And then LED is the past tense of to lead. And so often people will use LEAD, lead, when they mean to say LED. So that's one you have to watch out for. And then read and read, most people don't have trouble with that. And so we move into common grammatical word errors. And like I said, this is where people just use the wrong word or the wrong form of a word. And it's often coming down to parts of speech. And parts of speech are the different categories that words fall into. So nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and so on. So quote and quotation, this one particularly annoys me. And I don't really know why. But quote is a verb, whereas quotation is a noun. They're always used that way. They're not to be used interchangeably. People will use quote when they mean quotation, and they're wrong. So don't do that. Similarly, less and fewer, that doesn't bother me quite as much, although it is very common to misuse those. Uh, and I think it's because, again, our society tricks you into thinking that it's correct. So if you go to a grocery store, for example, and you want to use the express checkout, often there will be a sign that says something like 12 items or less. And that's wrong. It should be fewer. And that's because fewer is the word that you use when you have amounts that can be counted. If you have amounts that are uncountable, then you would use less. Anxious and eager mean opposite things. Anxious refers to anxiety, it's a type of fear. Eagerness refers to excitement. So I often hear someone say, I'm anxious to do something, when really they mean eager. So be careful with those. Literally and figuratively, uh, that's not too much of a problem. Literally is an actual truth, whereas figuratively means it's not an actual truth. Good and well. Uh, in this context, good is an adjective and well is an adverb. So if I ask, how are you doing? You should say that you're doing well, because doing is a verb. Adverbs modify verbs. So well would be the correct response. Good is an adjective in this case, which modifies nouns. So if I ask, how was that movie? Well, you could say it was a good movie. Movie is a noun, good is an adjective. You would not say it's a well movie because that wouldn't make sense. So likewise, if I ask how you're doing and you say you're doing good, that likewise doesn't make sense. Who and whom, uh, both pronouns, but they refer to different parts of the sentence. So remember that a sentence consists of a subject, an object, and a verb, or subject, verb, and object. So actor, action, and that which receives the action. Who refers to the subject or the actor of the sentence. Whom refers to the object or the receiver of the sentence. Credible and creditable. Credible means credible and believable and trustworthy. Creditable means able to receive credit. This next one really annoys me. Decent and good. So often I'll hear on the TV or on the radio, there's a decent chance of rain tomorrow or something along those lines. No, there's not. Rain is not decent nor indecent. You could say there's a good chance of rain or a high chance of rain, but you can't be a decent chance of rain. Decent refers to decency. It's either decent or indecent. Good is, in this context, something that is either good or bad. Right? So it's possible to equate decency with good, but that's not the way that people are using those words. So be careful with that. So again, these are really common errors. So I see these a lot in writing. So you need to be able to keep an eye out for these. So make sure that you're not using the wrong word. And then finally, common spelling errors. Definite versus defiant. That's when I always have to stop and think about myself, because when I want to spell definite, I want to put an A in there. And I'm not alone. Many people have that same problem. I don't know why, but that is our impulse. So yeah, definite has no A. Possess, poses, and posses. People get into trouble when dealing with double letters. So possess, for example, Possess versus poses, Poses. Often I've seen people write possess, or rather write posses or poses when they mean to write possess. So double letters confuse people. That's why there is so common for people to use loose when they mean lose. They put an extra O in there. Chose and choose, less of a problem, although sometimes you do still see that. Quiet and quite, another common spelling error. And I understand that because that's just a simple transposition of the last two letters, the E and the T. And often I think if you're typing, your hands can get ahead of your thoughts a little bit, and so you'll end up making that common mistake. And a spell check program won't catch it because it's spelled correctly. It's just the wrong word. Where and were, often people confuse those. I don't know why. There's where, as in the apostrophe of for we are. That's misused sometimes, but typically it's where and were that people get wrong. Of and off, I've seen that one confused many times. And then through and thorough, that's an easy mistake to make because of the thorough has the extra O in there. So those are really common spelling errors that you have to watch out for. There's really no sort of trick to spelling correctly. You just have to be aware of what your weaknesses are when it comes to spelling and watch out for those. So if you know that you consistently misspell a word, pay more attention to it to make sure that you spell it correctly. Yeah, don't rely on a spell check program. Those are handy little tools, but you still have to proofread just in case. Okay, and then finally, the draft due. So the first draft of the rhetorical analysis is due at the end of this week. So, like I've said before, with these revision and editing lessons, I will only hold you responsible for the material that we have covered up to that point. So last time we covered punctuation and revision in general. This time we've covered revising introductions and word errors. So now that's an extra layer of responsibility in your writing. So I expect you to use both punctuation and words correctly, um, because I mean I will mark you down for errors in those areas. And then for your introduction, I expect you to have an introduction that consists of those three necessary parts of the subject, the topic, and the thesis. And I expect you to use some of those techniques to engage the reader. I'm holding you responsible for that now. Okay. So in the rhetorical analysis, I expect you to have strong introductions and no errors in punctuation or words. Okay, and that's it for this week. Next week, we're getting pretty close to the midterm, so we'll talk about how to take an essay exam. So I will see you then. Until then, take care, take it easy.